Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Really happy that everybody had a chance to join today. I am about to introduce, our webinar, How Great Leaders Foster Psychological Safety. And I'm Karen Wood. I'm a marketing leader here at InfoPro Learning. I manage our product marketing function here at InfoPro Learning, and I'm the sponsor of this program. Now, InfoPro Learning is a full-service learning and development partner offering a full range of services, including award-winning custom e-learning, video solutions to augment your own learning development, and a whole bunch of different services to help you really drive very compelling learning that drives outcomes that you're looking for. We have a few people still joining us, so bear with us as we bring people into the meeting today. I wanted to briefly go through a few logistics around this expected etiquette for today's session. So one of the things for today's session is we're really thrilled to have a nice intimate group that we're hoping can be very interactive and informal. So what we're recommending is if all of you could remain muted, unless you have a question that you want to ask or even a comment that you'd like to make, then you're absolutely welcome to take yourself off mute and just make this conversational and interactive. We have a great presenter here today that I'll introduce in just a second, but it's a really good opportunity for you to be able to talk to him directly and with the other colleagues that have joined here on the session. You're also welcome to use the raise hand option. So if you don't want to take yourself directly off mute and would like to be called upon, absolutely do that. We'll be looking and monitoring for that throughout the webinar. So no need to wait for the end. We have polls as we kind of go through the webinar today. So we would love for you to be active in the polls, participate. It'll help drive the conversation forward. And I think will be kind of fun for the group as well. And then also throughout the presentation today, feel free to use chat, share, ask questions and comments. I mean, one of the benefits of a nice group like we have today is that it can be very kind of informal and conversational while, there are very rich takeaways from today's session. So with that out of the way, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. So Dan Rust, the speaker today, is a best-selling author and speaker focusing on workplace culture and leadership development. Now, Dan is the Vice President of Global Leadership Development here at InfoPro Learning. So Dan and I work closely together, and also with a team of researchers, developers, and instructional designers who focus exclusively on the leadership space. Now, Dan will not be the one to toot his own horn, so I'll just do it for him during this introduction. But he and his team work with hundreds of different client organizations. We have, and Dan's program has off-the-shelf leadership programs for emerging leaders, programs for mid-career professionals, and for senior executives. They also develop custom and hybrid programs, and our clients really love working with Dan. I like working with Dan too. Dan's the real deal. I gain a lot of insight, every time I do webinars with Dan. So I'm excited to be here. He has decades of research and practical experience helping people at all levels. So I'd like to turn things over to Dan at this point. Welcome, Dan. Thank you for joining the webinar.
Hey.
And the group is in your hands.
All right. Hello, everybody. As Karen mentioned, I did write a book titled Workplace Poker. And I'm mentioning it because it is part of the foundation of what we're going to cover today. Not the content of the book itself, but the conversations that were created as a result of writing and publishing the book. I would say the very best part of that experience was, in fact, opening lots and lots of doors where every week somebody reads it, somebody reaches out via LinkedIn or email or in some other way with either a question, an insight, a challenge, an issue, and those individual conversations inform my point of view when it comes to workplace situations, the modern workplace culture, and that's obviously relevant to psychological safety. The other quick thing I want to share with you is because whenever I hear Karen introduce me, I get it feels a little awkward and uncomfortable because I know that's the interesting, I guess, professional part of who I am. Just to share with you, there are also lots of things that I'm not really good at. One of which is golf. I had an experience several years ago where I had explained to a group of colleagues that I couldn't play golf with them because I just was really, really bad at it. For worse than they probably could imagine an adult human being could be. So they actually set up an indoor golf simulator event. They wanted to include me. They wanted to be me to be a part of their golfing thing. So it was great. They actually went out of their way to include me because I just didn't feel comfortable going out, and golfing uh, 9 holes or 18 holes or whatever. So at this simulator, I actually had the experience of stepping up, hitting a ball as hard as I possibly could, and unfortunately, the ball kind of pinged up to one of the pillars and then a pipe and then bounced. And I swear to you, this is absolutely true, even though it sounds like no, this can't happen. It bounced right back and hit me in the forehead, hard, not soft. It was a hard hit in the forehead, and I actually had to sit down. The owner of the franchise came over and sat with me a bit, wanting to make sure I wasn't too injured. And what I came to realize later is that his liability insurance didn't cover golfing accidents because they'd never contemplated that somebody might actually injure themselves in a golf simulator. So again, that's just a little bit of me and my background. And as Karen mentioned, I head up a leadership development practice for InfoPro Learning. And InfoPro I think of as a mothership of learning and development capabilities. There are teams and divisions and departments that handle just about anything related to any aspect of learning and development. I specifically work with a team of researchers, uh, instructional designers, developers who focus exclusively on the leadership space. And the team I work with uh, has a library of off the shelf programs that are continually refreshed and updated, and then these programs are used to develop custom iterations for clients and hybrids for clients. So many of our clients we will work with and curate content to create something that's unique to them, that feels very much like a bespoke custom suit to them, but in fact is built on pieces and parts from various programs so that we can do it more rapidly, more cost effectively, et cetera. So that's my professional day-to-day role. And what's again interesting for me is that I every week I have conversations with individuals who reach out to me about their careers, about their workplace experiences, and I have conversations with business leaders about what's happening in their workplace culture. And as these conversations accumulate, there are broad themes that start to develop. And as I've thought about the last 3 years in particular and the shift that I've seen in the last 3 years, it's very clear if you look on the slide here, and I'm not going to go through every one of these bullet points, but I just want to give you a sense of the conversations that I have. Employees are wanting more empathy from their leaders. They're wanting more real growth opportunities. They are rethinking the work reward contract. And whether you agree or disagree, whether you think that's reasonable or not, it's simply true that employees are wanting more, and more is probably the big theme. They want more from the job, more from the company, more from their leaders, more of a sense of inclusion and a sense of relevance in whatever they're doing. They are rejecting menial work or mundane work, or if they're forced to do menial or mundane work, they advocate more for themselves in terms of what that work is really worth, and what that quote unquote contract is between employee and employer. So all of those things are being rethought and renegotiated, at least in the minds of employees. Leaders, on the other hand, what they will tell me is, in fact, I just had a conversation a few weeks ago with a leader who said, I have the same top-down pressures that I have always had, pressures to produce, to deliver results. That has not changed. If anything, that's gotten more intense recently. But now I have these bottom-up pressures. They want me to be more. They want me to be more empathetic. They want me to create psychological safety. They want me to mentor them, to coach them. And I just don't know how do I do all of that? It's I don't necessarily think differently. I would like to be all of those things, but at some point you only have so many arms and legs and brain cells to bring to the workplace. So that natural tension between what employees are wanting and what leaders are hoping but aren't sure, how to do and how to be, that's sort of where I sit every week. And when I look at a topic like psychological safety, that's the prism through which I look at it. And so I'd like to start by asking you to contemplate your own existing workplace right now. And I know most of you probably didn't really come to a session like this thinking, "Oh, I don't feel psychologically safe. So, hey, let me go to that session." This is probably more of an intellectual exercise for you, want to learn more about the topic overall, which is perfectly fine. But I would like to start for a moment with you thinking about just your own experience in the workplace, and to what degree is it psychologically safe? And by the way, extra credit for anyone or the first person who in the chat can reference the movie from which this screenshot was taken. As a clue, it was from the 70s. You have to think back, and let's just see if anybody really jumps in. And in fact, just to make it more interesting, I'd be happy to mail a copy of Workplace Poker to whoever is the first person to name the movie. Going once, going twice. We'll let you contemplate it a bit. Actually, if you just Google "quote unquote" is it safe, it'll 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 come to you. So in contemplating your own environment, just your own workplace situation. Uh, no, not a Clockwork Orange, but excellent guess. That would be an excellent like intellectual guess where you're putting the dots together. I will say, if you know, you know. If you saw the movie, you know, because it's a key line from the movie. Um, so I would ask that you think about your workplace, and I'm going to prompt you with a few questions, and just ask to what degree can you agree that these statements reflect, yes, uh, uh, Guerramina, yes, Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman. So, statement number one: we have a strong team of high performers with everyone bringing unique value. We're all valued contributors, and none of us could be easily replaced. So, I'm just asking you to reflect, to what degree is that true for me and my workplace? Roles and accountabilities are clear here. The right people are accountable for the right things. Nobody avoids accountability when something goes wrong. Again, to what degree does that reflect your experience in your workplace? My own role within our organization is secure. I see a path forward for my own career advancement for at least the next 5 years. From a financial and business results perspective, our organization is doing quite well. We have a solid track record for delivering results. I have observed others speaking up and not paying a price for having an alternative viewpoint, meaning different from that of leadership. Our managers and leaders are highly competent and have proven that we can trust their judgment. Our managers and leaders do not have or play favorites. There is no in group. None of our managers or leaders, either consciously or subconsciously, like it when others are hyper respectful or hyper responsive because of the perceived power of those managers and leaders. It's probably the most subtle of these points, because it's sometimes hard to tell, and there is a little bit of a, I guess, emotional juice that gets created when somebody is hyper responsive. And you find some leaders who really like that. They like that feeling of, I say jump and people say how high, as opposed to I say jump and people say, really? Or, well, tell us what you mean exactly by jump. So you contemplate those questions, and I'm going to launch a poll. This is it's a confidential poll, so your individual identity will not be, we won't see your individual identity. I am going to share the entire poll results. But basically, what I'm asking you to do is give us a quick gauge of your world of work. And what's the level of psychological safety in your world of work? Um, so I'm assuming you can all see the poll now and you can begin to respond to the poll.
Dan, I can confirm I am able to see the poll.
Excellent. Okay. We'll give it just a few more moments, give people a moment to contemplate. So we're having a essentially kind of a split between definitely yes, which is fantastic, of course, and then not sure, probably not, and a few definitely knows. Um, you can give it 20 more seconds. And Karen, can you confirm, can people see the poll results?
Yeah, and it's in the chat. So I think you have to click
Okay,
over to the chat to see the results, but then I
okay,
believe everybody should be able to see that.
fantastic. Thank you. Um, Excellent. So I appreciate that. And also, you know what? It gives me a sense of who we have in the room, so to speak, who we have actually going through this program itself. So let me move on. I'm going to close out the poll and move on here. You know, I think to truly understand psychological safety and to understand it at a deep level, this is not going to be a course on anthropology, but I think you do have to go back about 50,000 years to when humans as we know them today were first forming, were first evolving. And the truth is, at that time, as our minds were evolving and our habits and our approaches to each other were evolving, we lived in very small groups. We groups of perhaps 40 to 50, sometimes as large as 100 and 150, but those were the rare exceptions. And within those small groups, our survival mechanism was primarily our ability to cooperate within those groups. We were not the strongest. We actually weren't even the smartest of the hominids, out in the world. We were not the smartest, not the strongest, not the most capable. But in fact, we were the most cooperative with each other, interestingly cooperative within our own group. And that degree of cooperation was such a key to our survival that it became ingrained in part of our psychological beings. We learned to cooperate with each other within our group, but what we also learned was to compete against other groups when resources were abundant. When food was abundant, we leaned into our cooperation within our group. When resources were slight, when suddenly we were competing for water, competing for food, it became very much a competition between us and other groups. And that unique psychology of I find my group, I find my tribe, I cooperate within my group, I connect within my group, and I compete against other groups. It's a very unique human psychology, where we see um, not just cooperation within our species. We see cooperation and competition, intense competition, oftentimes even to the point of wars. And so that human dynamic, that mental dynamic, as we bring it into the modern workplace, we as humans are not built naturally to work very closely with lots of people who might not be part of our natural tribe, who might not be part of our, if you were to choose the people that you would spend your days with, there are many people that we work with who we might not choose to work with, who would not be our part of our what we might call an organic tribe of people. So cooperation within a group like this becomes inherently a bit challenging. And then you add some layers of complexity in the modern work environment, starting with the fact that today we have 5 generations at work. And when we talk about the term psychological safety, it's fascinating to have psychological safety conversations with different individuals and to see how they process even that term. And much of the viewpoint of each of these cohorts of generations comes from their formative years. And their formative years, typically in their late teens, perhaps mid to late teens to mid to late 20s, those formative years stick with most of them through the rest of their lives. So the silent generation, there are actually still people in that age group in the workplace. Uh, a small percentage of those are there because they are still capable, because they still want to work. They're still creating value in the workplace. The larger percentage of that cohort, they're still working because they have to work. But they do still exist in the modern workplace. And to them, psychological safety is even if they're feeling uh, a lack of psychological safety, even if they're feeling put upon, even if they're feeling, if you're, a 75-year-old Walmart greeter and you've got a 22-year-old manager who is, basically abrasive and abusive to you, you may feel it, but you don't feel comfortable talking about it. It's not something that has been part of their vocabulary, part of their existence. So the silent generation really doesn't talk much about psychological safety because I think in their minds, it was never something they could feel they deserved or should be able to talk about. Whereas baby boomers get very frustrated with psychological safety because to them, the system works. The system where you just have to work the system. In their formative years, they formed during the baby boom period. They formed when the rising tide was, we know now, not lifting all boats, but was lifting many boats. And this is the Mad Men era. This is the era of, hey, you roll up your sleeves, you dig in, you work, and if you work the system will work for you. And even to a slight degree, Gen X still has that point of view. If you work the system will work for you. The distinction with Gen X is they are more independent than their parents because many of them were left alone while their parents were working the system. Gen X kids were at home, figuring out how to work life on their own to a large degree. So you see this dichotomy of trust in the system between the silent generation, baby boomers and Gen X, and millennials and Gen Z. Millennials and Gen Z, while there are certainly exceptions, broadly speaking, have not seen the system work for them, have not seen the system work for the broad spectrum of people, have seen, in fact, what they've seen is even when we look back at Gen X years than the baby boomer formative years, now we are much more transparent about who was not being taken care of, who the system was not working for, even in that past. And it creates very different points of view regarding the workplace itself and regarding the topic of psychological safety. And I'll go into a little more detail there, but we'll give you just one example of how these groups think so differently about almost everything in life. Recently, Prince Charles was crowned King Charles. I'm sure many of you either saw that on television or you heard about that. Well, the silent generation, they reacted to King Charles by, for the most part, saying, you know what? It's his turn. He waited patiently. He represents a grand tradition, and now the United Kingdom has a new king. Uh, Baby boomers were more along the lines of, well, he's a little stuffy. I love the pageantry, though. The pageantry is impressive. The royal family is kind of fascinating. It maybe will be a little more interesting once Prince William becomes king because Camilla is a bit of a drag, and I still don't care for how she treated Diana. But I think that when we have the new king and the new queen coming up, that'll be interesting. Whereas Gen X looks at all of this and asks, what is the point of royalty? What is the purpose of royalty? It makes no sense. Millennials say, I've got many more important things to be focusing on than paying attention to the British royal family. Although I might post something kind of snarky on social media, for the most part, this is not relevant to me. And then Gen Z says, do you know where those crown jewels came from? Do you know Gen Z knows where those jewels came from? They know the story under the story under the story of the United Kingdom, and they will be happy to tell you the horrors that were put upon various countries in order to draw out those precious stones. So my point here is not to agree or disagree with any point of view. It is simply to say we've got 5 generations in the workplace that look at the world very differently. And of course, then they're going to perceive um, workplace culture and the topic of psychological safety very differently. You add to that, add to the elements of generational diversity, you add all the other elements of diversity beyond race, gender, sexuality. They're, human beings are complex creatures. Human beings have unique backgrounds, unique experiences. There are lots and lots of variations of human beings in the modern workplace, which on the one hand is fantastically wonderful. It means you have lots of different ways to innovate, lots of different ideas and minds, coming to the fore. But it's also challenging because how do you find your tribe in a team of in a teaming group of lots of different individuals and people? It makes it more complicated than it might have been in the 70s or the 80s or even going back to the 50s. Also, one of the things that if you go back 80 years. Um, while the world itself has become more and more globalized over the last 80 years, from a broad communication standpoint, up until about the early 2000s, you had overall communication very tightly. I'm not going to use the word controlled necessarily, but there really weren't that many communication vehicles. There were 3, maybe 4 major communication channels. While there were newspapers in every major city, the newspapers tended to cover the same issues in the same way. We were actually converging toward, when you heard people talk about globalization in the 1990s, what they meant by globalization was we're becoming homogenized. We're becoming more and more and more like each other. But starting, I think, primarily with the internet, but also other technologies, globalization started to mean not convergence. Globalization started to mean expansion. Lots and lots and lots of different points of view, lots and lots of perspectives. This is when you started to hear a lot of commentary about the truth of news. The term fake news came out of a decade or so later, but you had this expansion of social media expansion, and the reason I'm sharing all this with you is if you start to think about how Gen Z thinks about psychological safety and thinks about their workplace and thinks about their culture and thinks about their life, they are the first generation whose formative years were completely immersed in social media. For the rest of us, or for many of us, social media is something relatively new. It might be interesting, it might be annoying, but it didn't come along during our formative years. For the younger generations, absolutely. It is part of their formative years, which means exposure to lots and lots and lots and lots of different things, which, on the one hand, is perhaps interesting and entertaining, but it can also be overwhelming. Those of you who perhaps grew up in the 70s, if you were getting career guidance in the 70s, a career guidance person, a career counselor, would take a look at your grades, would take a look at your family connections, would take a look at your financial resources, might factor in a few other things like what do you want to do? You want to be a doctor, a lawyer, basically we're going to send you off in one of 5 or 7 different directions and find a career path that works for you. And career guidance back then, I'm going to say, while it sounded complicated, it was relatively simple compared to today. Career guidance, career pathing today, you first of all start with the assumption that nobody just has one career path. Nobody just has one career. And you have younger people in particular asking the question, what can I count on? If I'm going to invest money in a college degree, I'd like to know there's going to be a there, even 4 years from now, 5 years from now. If I'm going to invest that time, where do I invest that time? And those answers aren't always clear. In fact, they're often quite cloudy. But then even once they get into the workplace, for many young people, the workplace is not what they expected it to be. It's not friendly. It is overwhelming. And then you add to that the pandemic. You add to that we move into this virtual environment where suddenly we have to figure out, how do we internalize knowing hundreds of people virtually and having this sense that I'm connected, but not really connected? And there's a new term called virtual paranoia, which is essentially, it references this feeling that some virtual employees have where they may actually spend a lot of their day, quote unquote, connected, like in Teams meetings with people. They get a lot of face-to-face interaction, virtual face-to-face interaction. But over time, they develop a sense of paranoia, feeling like they're not really connected because simply connecting virtually, while it feeds us to some degree, we don't get the same thing that we get from actually being face to face, engaging with somebody, feeling them right in front of us. And so virtual workers can develop a sense of paranoia, a sense of feeling like, I don't know if I'm really connected to the group. I don't know what's going on when I'm not in meetings, what's happening when meetings happen without me. And we can start to feel very isolated. So all of this occurs, and we all feel like we're experiencing it alone ourselves. And again, I'm speaking primarily to younger employees, but it affects all of us. But really what I want you to think about is, how does it affect those who are still in their formative years? I'm a relatively mature guy. I can navigate through all of this, and I will figure my way through one way or the other, because I was my mental structure was created in a very different time and place. So you see many younger employees feeling alone, feeling uncertain, wondering how do I navigate these waters? And then there's another factor. Um, does anybody on the in this meeting know the value of Jeff Bezos's new yacht that was just launched, I think, in the last 2 or 3 months? Let's just see if anybody on the chat knows the value of his yacht. To see if anybody quickly types in the value of his yacht. I think many of us have heard about Jeff Bezos's yacht and Jeff Bezos's life. I'm not seeing anything here. Well, then perhaps we follow different social media channels, because I was overwhelmed on Facebook and Instagram, and also with several news feeds. And it's a $600 million yacht. So every week, uh, it was hundreds of millions, 600 million. Think about that a moment. 600 million was the value or the price of building this yacht. 600 million, I would bet, is more than the annual revenue of some of your companies, those of you who are in this meeting. And I share this as just one example. We hear about income inequality, and I don't want to debate whether income inequality is in fact worse today than ever before. What's definitely true is that the perception of income inequality is hugely more intense than ever before. And Bezos is just one example. Uh, Through social media, we are being fed so many examples of people who are extraordinarily wealthy. The latest billionaire that came through in my feed a couple of weeks ago is Kourtney Kardashian. Kardashian is a billionaire now. She's worth more than $1 billion based on, not really sure, based on whatever it's based on. The point is that many young people are, these are their formative years. And they're seeing this complicated world that they don't necessarily have full access to. And just here's an example of a young woman working in an Amazon warehouse, and her productivity is tracked to the point where at the end of a work shift, the number of boxes that she has loaded per hour is being tracked. So her level of activity is being tracked. And if she falls below a certain standard, she has a manager who comes to her and says, hey, you know what? You're dipping below our standard. We really need you to pick up the pace tomorrow. That's her lived experience at work. And she comes home at the end of the day. If she can afford, a healthy meal, she'll make herself a healthy meal, perhaps. But as she's tracking her social media, avoid seeing that the CEO of her company is living this particular lifestyle. And that's, again, that's just one of hundreds of examples. And you cannot tell me this does not have a huge impact on how our workplace cultures are perceived and also the perception of psychological safety. So if you, like me, are one of the baby boomers who have in the past perhaps poo-pooed the issue of psychological safety, the reality of it being an issue, it's absolutely an issue. And it's being driven by multiple factors. So it's not just bosses being mean. It's not just people being suddenly laid off. It's not just any one thing. It's very multifaceted. And and it's driven because our brains are built to crave certainty. We don't like uncertainty. We crave relevance. We want to know that we matter. Back to, again, the formative evolution of our brains. We want to belong. We want within our tribe. We want to know we matter. We have a role within our tribe. Our role has meaning. I'm the one who makes the fires. I'm the one who goes and gets the meat. I'm the one who builds the whatever. I matter to my group. I also know that humans want to progress. We want to grow and we want to be included and we want to belong. This is such a core craving of our brains that for many, particularly younger workers in today's environment, they don't experience that. They struggle to experience that. And I talk to businesses, I'm not going to say every week, let's say every couple of weeks, I have at least one conversation with a business that says, we're struggling to retain our younger workers. We hire them, we keep them for about 6 months, they move on, and when we do get feedback, they say it just isn't right for me. It's just not a cultural fit for me, or it's just not right for me. And they're not really giving us anything tangible oftentimes. But what oftentimes they're really saying is, I came into the organization with high hopes, but I just don't feel like I belong. I don't feel like you feel that I belong. And maybe not you, Mr. Recruiter, but on the ground floor level, I don't feel like I belong. So if you can create an environment of psychological safety, particularly for your newer employees, that's when people are at their most psychologically vulnerable. They're trying to figure out, how do I navigate these waters of this new place, this new family, this new tribe, this new group of people? How do I figure out how I belong? If you can create an environment of high psychological safety, particularly for them, you will increase retention. You will boost productivity because all that energy that is now being invested in, how do I navigate these waters? How do I ensure that I'm going to be okay? If you can release all of that anxiety energy, if you can release all of that stress energy and have it be directed towards something more productive, it will absolutely boost productivity, boost cooperation, creativity, innovation. For the most part, innovation requires people to think differently than the group, people to feel the comfort of taking the risk of, all right, everyone else is going in this way, going in this direction. What about this? Thinking about a different way of doing, thinking, being requires a certain bravery, requires a certain amount of psychological safety. And yes, there are certain people who are just hardwired to not give a rip what anyone else thinks. And those may be, the great innovators, but those are rare enough that we can't count on building our businesses with just those individuals. So my point here is that creating an environment or a culture of psychological safety is an absolute business imperative. So what do we do about it? Well, we know that that sense of belonging, and I'm sure you hear certain terms regularly. You hear inclusion, belonging, psychological safety. There are probably other phrases and words that you hear that come along with this. They don't all mean exactly the same thing. I think of them as different sides of the Rubik's cube of workplace culture. They're very closely related. I mean, you can't have a culture of belonging without high psychological safety, and also you can't achieve psychological safety if people don't feel like they really belong. But I think we also have to remind ourselves that belonging for some can create exclusion for others. I just spoke earlier this week with a woman. She's an executive at an organization in Europe, and part of their challenge is they have a deeply ingrained belonging culture for their company. The company has been around for 80 years, and the people who have most of the employees have worked for the company their entire careers. So having a 20, 30-year career at this organization, not unusual at all. And these people are very tightly bonded. They know each other. Their families know each other. Their children and their children's children know each other, have married each other. They're so very tight bonding. However, new employees coming into this organization, sure, they might be invited to the same picnics. They might be invited to the same evening events. They might be technically included, but uh, kind of tough to crack the code of this very tight-knit family within the company. And so she, to her credit, they had become aware of the downside of such a tight-knit sense of belonging, almost a clan or a cult within the organization. And how do you crack open that cult and make it, more accessible, more available to others? Um, I imagine some of you at some point in your lives have felt excluded, felt like you were the other, you were the outsider. For many of us, this might go back to our formative childhood years or our early years within the work world, where you just don't feel like you quite fit in while you're trying to find your way. And as you know, that feeling of exclusion, it has deep effect on many people, physiological effects, emotional effects, and of course, workplace productivity effects as well. So when we talk about psychological safety and belonging in the same sentence, in the same voice, we're not talking about exactly the same thing, but we are referencing very, very similar characteristics within a workplace culture. And so I this is a phrase that comes from, I think I first heard this from someone who was a behavioral therapist, and she said, hurt people, meaning oftentimes people who themselves have been damaged or excluded without consciously intending to, oftentimes damage or exclude others. And that's sometimes how psychological safety or the lack thereof tends to filter its way into an organization where exclusion breeds exclusion breeds exclusion, lack of safety breeds lack of safety breeds lack of safety. And so it's something we have to be very attentive to, and also be attentive to what I call the psychological safety butterfly effect. Butterfly effect means it's the old adage, a butterfly in Singapore flaps its wings, and the impact of those wings as you cross the ocean gets greater and greater, and ultimately contributes to a hurricane in Tampa, Florida. So the butterfly effect is, a little thing happens here, which has a bigger impact, and then a bigger impact, and then a bigger impact, and ultimately some major thing is occurring. I think oftentimes we don't, as leaders, recognize our own butterfly effect. The little things that we do, the micro behaviors, the micro expression, not expressions, the micro exclusions that occur, and how those have an effect on others. So in live meetings and virtual meetings, who you call on, who you ask to contribute, um, when people are sharing their thoughts and ideas, as a leader, whether you're conscious or not, when you are really tracking with somebody's thoughts, you're probably nodding. You're probably giving off a lot of nonverbal cues that, hey, I'm tracking with you. Hey, this all is making sense to me. Hey, thanks. I really appreciate what you're doing. Give me more. You're probably going to ask questions and draw out more. And then another person shares either an alternative point of view or just share something. And that person you maybe are not tracking so well with for whatever reason, and you just go flat. You don't do anything negative. You don't grimace at them, but you don't give them the same nonverbals that you were giving this other person. That's what I mean by a butterfly effect. You may not recognize what you're doing, but I can assure you that person who wasn't getting the nonverbal love from you, they go away either consciously or not with a sense of, well, that didn't go so well. I won't do that again, or I better be, careful, or what's, something's happening, something's going on, or they don't get the same thing that the other person gets. When leadership groups form inside groups, when they form a sense of, hey, whenever I hear the term our senior leadership team, our core leadership team, not that a company shouldn't have senior leadership teams, but if you don't consciously work to not make that feel like, okay, that's the in group, that's the group that knows what's really going on, and they will, as they choose to, let the rest of us know, it can start to feel like, when the senior leadership team meets, it's like the conclave of cardinals selecting the new pope. The senior leadership team is getting together. Senior leadership team is having an offsite. Senior leadership team had their weekly state of the business meeting, and what we're all doing is waiting for the smoke signals to come out. Oh, how is it going? Like, what's the first thing that they do? The first thing that they say? And I get that part of it. This is part of the normal working experience, but it is, I think, important that we're aware of these impacts of our micro behaviors. So in our last 10 minutes, I asked the question even of myself. So what do you do? I mean, all right. So, hey, let's assume we get that psychological safety is at risk for a lot of people, particularly younger workers. And we get that it's a good thing if you can create greater psychological safety. So then what do you do about it? I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, you ask yourself, is it in fact safe? And I'm going to ask you, just as a human to human, do not take people down a path of believing things are safe when in fact you know they are not. The worst thing you can do is tell someone, hey, we need you to speak up. We need to share your point of view. We need you to step out and take risks. We want to celebrate failures. We want you to be willing to work on a project. And if it doesn't work out, hey, just know that's important for our innovation. And we know that. Do not take someone down that path. If the truth is, if you're attached to a failed project, you're going to pay a price. If you share an unpopular opinion, you're going to pay a price. If you differ from the core leadership point of view. You're going to pay a price. So, number one, I would just ask you, as fellow humans, be aware and be cautious about how you guide people through their careers. You have to start with self-awareness and empathy for others, and I get that that reads a little like um, a fortune cookie. Yes, of course. Start with self-awareness and empathy for others. That's somewhat obvious, but it's easy to do, and it's also easy to not do. So but let's remind ourselves self-awareness and empathy. And then I would suggest, just on a regular basis, do what you can with others to be human as a colleague. Be a little flawed, a little imperfect, acknowledge you're a work in progress. So if you remember at the very beginning of this webinar, I shared the story of my lack of golfing ability. Uh, that was actually very intentional. It's a true story, and it also is not me at my finest moment. And I always, whenever we're crafting a presentation like this and we put our introduction together, there's a part of me that always says, okay, yeah, all the good stuff is great, but that's not the full picture. I mean, Dan Rust is definitely flawed, imperfect, and a work in progress. So let's bring a little humanity, and if it can be a little humorous as well, that's fantastic as well. Being human helps your employees feel like they can be human as well with you. Um, Go out of your way to tell your employees how they create value for your group, and also feel comfortable telling them when they don't or how they don't. But definitely tell them, here's what we really count on you for. Here's when you make a difference. Here, let them know the difference that they're making for the group. And some people interpret this as and everyone gets a trophy mentality. It's really not that. What it really is when someone is doing their job well, they are creating value. And just like we would do with a family, when your family gets together for dinner, even if you have the same one or two people making dinner every night of the week, don't you just get that every time dinner is served, it's important to tell the person who made dinner, hey, thank you for this. The dinner is lovely. This was great. Even if that's their role or function, we tell them how they create value for us regularly. We don't go on autopilot. Um, Give your employees clear roles and responsibilities and the resources to succeed. Our brains crave certainty, and for new employees in particular, they need clear direction, clear roles. Some of us, on the more mature end, over time, we've learned to work within the gray, and it's an important capability to develop, but it's a capability you develop over time. You don't hire someone and then throw them into the gray. You start with some clarity. As leaders, if you're really looking to make a shift in the sense of psychological safety for a group, I think it is important that you find ways to engage with them every day. In a live environment, that can simply mean stopping by their cubicle, stopping by their office, or in some other way. Um, Having that daily connection in a virtual environment, it's a little more challenging. Um, but finding ways, at the very least, in a virtual environment, to engage weekly, to weekly have a meeting like this with camera sharing and and connecting on a human level, and making sure that people feel like you aren't so busy. I talk to a lot of employees about their leaders, and one of the common characteristics they will say is, she's so busy. She's got so much going on. I just don't feel like I can or should bring my issues to her. Yeah, I've got some things, but it's just not. She's got a lot going on, and I get it. As leaders, sometimes we do have a lot going on, and also sometimes it's part of the persona that we project. Um, I would encourage you, for everyone that works with you or for you, if you're a leader, ask occasionally. So how am I doing? For you, individual employee, how am I doing? And as a group, as a team, as a company, how are we doing for you? How is it going for you? And don't just check the box and ask it once. I would ask it in one way or another. You don't want to make it feel too repetitive, but ask it quarterly. Ask it at least, once a year, but I think quarterly would feel a little more human. Just check in. How are we doing for you? And then be prepared to really listen for the answer. Don't just hear yeah, hey, things are going okay. All right, fantastic. We'll move on. Really be available. Um, in a virtual world, and we're short on time now, so I'm gonna clip through a couple of quick things that I hope you can take away. Um, the weird thing about virtual work now is we have to be intentional about creating friendships. We have to find these people. The great thing is, for example, with me, I've got friends in Serbia and the UK and on the East Coast and the West Coast. I've got friends now, but none of them was random or accidental. We had to find each other within our work environment. We had to decide, yeah, we're not only working well together, but we kind of connect, we kind of click. And then at a certain point, we decide we're going to be friends and we're going to spend virtual time just doing friend things virtually. But as an adult and in a virtual environment, you have to be much more conscious and intentional about that. It's not going to happen randomly. You're not going to wander into, the kitchenette. You're not going to wander into the meeting room and come across people and create those bonds in a more, traditional, natural way. Um, During economic contractions, this becomes even more critical. If you go back to the very beginning, we talked about during times of abundance, the group comes together and leverages their cooperation. In times of scarcity, the group focuses on their competitive spirit, and we divide ourselves into groups, and then we compete against other groups at a deep psychological level. That's part of what happens during an economic contraction. When we have reduced budgets, our clients become cautious, our employees become fearful, the leaders above you may become more demanding. There are lots of things happening when either for the business itself or the economy, when there's a contraction that occurs. And because I only have time for one final so what, I would just say focus on what you can control during those contractions and be visible. Because when your visibility is reduced, when suddenly you're not talking to people as much as you used to be talking to people, you create a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. If you create a vacuum where you're not around as much, you're not engaging as much, you're not as visible as you used to be, employees will fill that vacuum with their own doubts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that, out of respect for your time, is the final thing we're going to cover today. I always like to show you the respect of ending on time. So I'm going to go to my final slide here. Again, Dan Rust. You know where to find me on LinkedIn. You know where to find me. My podcast is the Leadership Disrupted podcast. If you want to find me, you'll figure out how to find me online, and would love to have any conversations with anybody about anything related to the modern workplace culture. So thank you, everybody. Hope it's been valuable for you, and hopefully we'll connect again at some point in the future. Bye now.